A struggling widow bumps into the most feared duke at the winter ball. His gaze shakes her soul. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. Snow had been falling over London since dawn, soft as ash, turning the rooftops into pale, silent waves. In a cramped attic room that never quite held the heat, Evelyn Hart pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching her breath ghost in the air as she counted the last coins in her palm. They did not even cover a week of rent. Below, the muffled sound of a fist against the front door drifted up the stairs, followed by the landlord's sharp voice and her younger brother's anxious answer. Her mother's cough, a dry, painful rasp, cut through everything else, reminding Evelyn that medicine cost more than food, and that hope, lately, felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. She tucked the coins away, as if hiding them might somehow make them multiply, and smoothed the worn black dress that announced her status to the world. Widow, struggling, easy to overlook, easier to dismiss. On the rickety chair beside her lay the one thing that might change their fate tonight. A folded invitation to the grand winter ball at Montclair House, borrowed time from the dressmaker who employed her, and a cramped letter written in her neat, careful hand. That letter carried the name that had haunted her since the night her husband never came home, Adrian Blackthorne, the Duke of Ravenska. People in the streets spoke his name the way they spoke of winter storms, distant, powerful, dangerous. To Evelyn, it was carved into the memory of her husband's last words, into the ink of the debt papers that now pressed against her chest like a stone. She had not been invited as a guest, of course. She was going as a seamstress, sent to adjust a lady's gown at the last hour. But she knew the Duke would be there, surrounded by chandeliers and music and people who had never had to choose between heat and food. If she could just reach him, if she could place her letter into his hand, perhaps the man who signed her ruin could also sign her release. Hours later, a modest hired carriage carried her across streets lined with snow, past gas lamps glowing like watchful eyes. Montclair House rose out of the white like something from another world, its windows spilling gold light onto the steps, its entrance crowded with silk and satin and polished boots. Evelyn's heart thudded as she stepped down, her gloved fingers clutching the small sewing case in one hand and the letter hidden in the other. Inside, the warmth and sound hit her at once. Violins singing, laughter bubbling, the faint scent of roses and spiced punch. Crystal chandeliers scattered light onto marble floors so smooth she could see the reflection of her black skirts. She kept to the edges, a shadow among jewels, slipping through corridors the staff had shown her, searching for the private hallway that, according to whispers in the workroom, led toward the Duke's study. Just one chance, she told herself. One moment of courage. Turning a corner too quickly, she collided with a passing footman, her sewing case slipping from her grasp. The lid sprang open, spools of thread and tiny silver needles scattering across the polished floor, skittering toward the entrance of the grand ballroom. Heat rushed to her face as she dropped to her knees, gathering them with trembling hands while the music swelled just beyond the archway. A ripple of laughter drifted out, bright and careless. When she reached for the last spool, a sudden shift in the room made her look up. The air seemed to thin, the chatter soften. People were moving aside, parting like water around a dark rock in a river. Through the archway, a tall figure in black stepped into view, shoulders squared, posture impossibly composed. Even from a distance, Evelyn saw the silver glint of a signet ring shaped like a raven on his hand. The Duke of Ravenska had arrived. A murmur followed him, not the warm murmur of admiration, but something sharper, edged with awe and unease. He moved with the certainty of a man who owned not just land and houses, but the silence around him. Evelyn, still on her knees, felt suddenly exposed, the plainness of her dress, the ink stain on her cuff, the thinness of her shoes. Her fingers closed around the hidden letter, crumpling the paper slightly. As she rose, her foot slipped on a stray needle, the world tilting for a heartbeat. She stumbled forward, crossing the invisible line between shadows and light, and crashed directly into the one man she had sworn to fear forever. Strong hands closed around her arms, steadying her before she could fall. For a breathless second, the music, the voices, the shimmer of the ballroom vanished. There was only his gaze, cool gray under the glow of the chandeliers, looking down into her wide, startled eyes. Something inside her chest trembled, as if the soul she had been forcing to endure simply to survive had been yanked awake. His expression did not soften, but it sharpened, as though he had just seen something he had not expected to find in all this glittering emptiness. And in that suspended moment, Evelyn Hart, struggling widow, realized that the man whose name had nearly broken her life would now be the man who could never again leave her untouched. Evelyn's breath caught as though the room had stolen it. For a single, suspended instant she stood held in his hands. The world narrowed to gray eyes, and the faint scent of cold air and starch, and something darker, like smoke clinging to wool. Then awareness rushed back in. The music, the glittering crowd, the sharp edge of a woman's laugh somewhere nearby. She stepped back as soon as he loosened his grip, lowering her gaze, heat rising along her neck. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, her voice barely steady. "I slipped." Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, a wave of whispers cresting and breaking around them. A lady in a gown the color of wine tilted her head, clearly delighted by the spectacle. "A seamstress does not usually find herself in the Duke's arms," she said lightly, loud enough for those closest to hear. Unless, of course, she had planned it. A little circle of laughter followed, bright and careless. Evelyn's fingers closed hard around the hidden letter in her palm, the paper biting into her skin. She knew better than to defend herself. Women like her were not allowed mistakes in rooms like this. The Duke's gaze flicked from her, face to the spilled needles and spools at their feet, then to the woman who had spoken. Something cool passed through his eyes. "The floor is unforgiving," he said simply. "Anyone might have slipped." His voice was smooth, measured, with a trace of roughness that made each word seem heavier than it should have been. The lady's smile faltered. With a faint inclination of his head, he dismissed the nearby crowd, and, like a flock of startled birds, they drifted away, their curiosity unsatisfied but their fear of offending him stronger than their appetite for gossip. Evelyn's heart hammered. She did not know what frightened her more, his unexpected defense or the fact that he now turned his full attention back to her. "You are not hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, eyes on the polished marble between them. "No, Your Grace. I should return to my work." She bent to gather the scattered sewing tools, but as she straightened, the letter slipped from her fingers, landing at his feet. Her stomach dropped. The name written across the folded page stared up at him in her careful handwriting. His own. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenska. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he stooped and picked it up with an ease that made her feel painfully clumsy. His thumb brushed the edge of the paper, eyes flickering briefly over the script. "You came here carrying this," he said. It was not a question. Evelyn forced herself to meet his gaze. She thought of the landlord's sharp voice that morning, reminding her that rent was due in 3 days, and that sympathy did not keep roofs from leaking. She thought of her mother, cheeks flushed with fever, counting the pills in the small brown bottle. She thought of her brother James, thin wrists and stubborn chin, pretending he was not hungry so she would eat more. And woven through all of that, she heard her husband's last warning, whispered on a night that smelled of rain and ink. "If anything happens to me," Thomas had said, his hand shaking over ledgers spread across their small kitchen table, "do not trust anyone who wears a raven on his ring." That ring now gleamed inches from her face. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied softly. "It is for you." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "You may leave it with my secretary." He began to tuck the letter inside his coat, clearly ready to turn away, ready to file her existence somewhere between a spilled drink and a smudged shoe. Desperation rushed up in her like cold water. If he treated this letter as just another petition in a stack, she would be back in that freezing attic with nothing but debts and apologies. "Please," she said, the word escaping before she could stop it. It hung there, small and naked in the air between them. "I only ask that you read it yourself. My husband, Thomas Hart, worked under your name. He died after discovering something wrong in the accounts." The debt collectors say your seal gives them the right to take everything from us. I have no one else who can change that. For the first time, a shadow of something that was not indifference passed through his eyes. His hand, still holding the letter, stilled. He knew the world thought of him as a man whose signature could make or break fortunes overnight. He had learned to live with the fear that followed his name, sometimes even to use it. But this was different. This was not a businessman seeking advantage, or a lord begging for leniency. This was a widow whose voice trembled but did not break, telling him that his name had reached into a narrow attic room and wrapped itself around a family's throat. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Mrs. Hart?" he asked quietly. Evelyn swallowed. "I am accusing you of nothing yet, Your Grace," she said. "I am asking you to look at what others are doing while they hide behind you." He held her gaze for a long, measuring moment. Then, without another word, he slipped the letter fully into his coat. "Return to your duties," he said. "You will have an answer." It was neither promise nor refusal, only a line drawn in ice. But as she watched him walk away, the raven on his ring catching the chandelier's light, Evelyn felt that something long buried had shifted, both in her life and in his. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the last notes of music had faded, the Duke of Ravenska would break the seal on her letter, and for the first time, he would see the name Thomas Hart and the quiet storm that death had left behind. Night settled heavily over Montclair House after the last carriage had rattled away, leaving only the echo of music and the faint scent of wax in the air. In his study, with the curtains drawn against the snowy darkness, Adrian Blackthorne broke the seal on the letter that had fallen at his feet. The fire in the grate burned low, throwing restless shadows across shelves of ledgers and leather-bound volumes. He read Evelyn Hart's careful handwriting line by line, his eyes moving slowly, his expression carved from stone. She wrote without ornament, each sentence measured, as if she had counted her words the way she counted coins. She spoke of Thomas, of long evenings spent over columns of figures that refused to balance, of the unease that grew in him when he realized certain debts had been reshaped and passed along in ways that never touched the official books. She wrote of the night he died, of the fall that made no sense in the narrow stairwell he had climbed safely for years, and of the men who came after, carrying papers stamped with the Ravenska seal and a smile that did not reach their eyes. She did not accuse him directly. Instead, she placed the facts in front of him and asked a single question. "How many of the people crushed under these debts did you mean to break, Your Grace? And how many were offered without your knowledge as sacrifices in your name?" Adrian lowered the page and stared at the fire for a long moment. The name Thomas Hart stirred something faint in his memory, a report mentioned and then buried under more urgent matters. The name that stood out more sharply was the one written near the bottom of her letter, beside a date and a ledger number. Victor Langley, his chief financial steward. The man who had served the House of Ravenska for years with impeccable politeness and a talent for making even bad news sound like an advantage. In the quiet of the study, Adrian felt a thin thread of unease pull tight in his chest. At dawn, snow still clung to the rooftops of the narrow street where Evelyn lived. The landlord came early, as if summoned by the cold itself, his breath puffing in little clouds as he stood in the doorway with a man in a dark coat at his side. The stranger carried a folder of papers edged in red. The Ravenska seal shone faintly on each page like a bruise. Evelyn stood in the cramped front room, hands folded, while her mother watched from the bed and James hovered near the doorway, shoulders tense. The man in the dark coat explained, in a voice that sounded bored, that the grace period on their debt was nearly over, that the House of Ravenska could not be expected to wait forever for payment, that she was free to be grateful they had shown patience at all. His eyes drifted over the bare furniture with quiet judgment, as if the poverty before him were a personal failing rather than a circumstance. Evelyn felt humiliation prickle under her skin, but she kept her voice calm, asking for time that the man had no intention of granting. Before he could finish his practiced speech, a second knock sounded. A different messenger stood on the step, this one wearing the livery of Montclair House. He carried a single envelope, heavy cream paper, addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Hart in a hand she did not recognize but a crest she could not mistake. When she broke the seal, the world seemed to narrow to the ink on the page. She was instructed to present herself at the Duke of Ravinska's city office that afternoon. No further explanation was given. Hours later, Evelyn stood in a high-ceilinged waiting hall paneled in dark wood that smelled faintly of lemon oil. Men in well-cut coats and women in fine shawls waited on benches, murmuring to secretaries, clutching documents and hopes. Evelyn's plain black dress and worn gloves drew more than one curious glance. A young woman in a fashionable hat looked her over with open curiosity. "They will let anyone in these days," she said lightly to her companion. "Perhaps she is here to ask His Grace to forgive falling in love with his coat." The companion laughed softly. Evelyn kept her eyes fixed on the far door, every muscle in her back straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. When her name was finally called, she felt her heart beat so loudly she wondered if others could hear it. She was led through a corridor lined with tall windows into a large office that looked out over the white-capped roofs of the city. Adrian stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, the Ravinska ring catching a slant of pale winter light. A gray-haired man with a neat mustache, whom she guessed was the secretary, hovered near a side table with a ledger open. "Mrs. Hart," the Duke said, turning toward her. His expression revealed nothing of the man who had caught her when she fell. "You asked for my attention. You have it. Speak clearly. There are others who need this room after you." The reminder of her place stung, but it also steadied her. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of her family's future on each footfall. "You have read my letter, Your Grace," she said. "You know that men using your seal have come to my door. I am not asking for charity. I am asking you to look at your own house and decide whether you are content to let it be built on the ruin of people who never chose to gamble with you." A faint line appeared between his brows. "If your husband involved himself in matters he did not understand, that is regrettable," Adrian said, his tone cool and formal. "But I cannot rebuild every life that ends in miscalculation." The words fell like ice. Behind him, the secretary shifted, and somewhere deep in the building a clock chimed the hour. Evelyn felt a flush climb her throat, but she forced herself to remain standing, chin level. "Then at least tell me this," she replied quietly. "Do you know what Victor Langley has done with your name?" "Because my husband died trying to warn someone." Adrian held her gaze, and for a fraction of a second the distance between them wavered. He dismissed his secretary with a brief nod. When the door clicked shut, the silence that followed was different, stripped of witnesses and pretense. "I intend to find out exactly what has been done with my name," he said at last, his voice lower now. "Until I do, Mrs. Hart, you will not lose your home. That is all I can offer you today." It was not an apology, not even close. Yet as Evelyn stepped back into the cold corridor, she realized it was also not nothing. Somewhere behind those guarded gray eyes, the most feared man in London had started to question the ground under his own feet. Snow fell again 2 days later, a finer dust this time, drifting past the narrow windows of the Hart home like ash shaken from an unseen fire. Evelyn had just finished mending a neighbor's torn coat when another knock sounded, sharp and impatient. Her stomach tightened. The landlord stood on the threshold with 2 men in plain but well-made coats behind him, their expressions polite and unmoved. One of them held a leather folder. The red-edged papers inside were now as familiar to Evelyn as the lines on her own hands. "Mrs. Hart," the landlord began, tugging off his hat, "I have been very understanding, but understanding does not patch roofs or pay coal merchants. These gentlemen represent interests connected to the House of Ravinska, and they insist the temporary hold on your account has expired." The taller of the 2 men smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The Duke's office confirmed only that you would not be removed without further review," he said smoothly. "Unfortunately, review does not suspend interest forever. We are here to assess what can be taken as partial payment. Furniture, perhaps. Personal items of value." His gaze slid over the room, pausing on the small clock that had been a wedding gift, on the thin silver locket at Evelyn's throat. James stepped forward before she could stop him. "You cannot just walk in and start taking things," he said, voice rough with anger he was too young to carry. "We live here." The man's brows lifted. "Young sir, the law does not recognize sentiment as currency." Evelyn laid a hand on her brother's arm, feeling the tremor in him. Her mother watched from the bed, eyes wide and bright with worry, fingers twisting in the blanket. Humiliation fanned out in Evelyn's chest like heat from a fire that did not warm. "You have read the note from His Grace's office," she said, forcing each word to remain steady. "It said we would not lose our home." The man with the folder tilted his head. "You are not being put out," he said. "Not yet. But you have chairs. You have a clock. You have a few pieces of jewelry. It is only reasonable that we reduce your balance." As he spoke, the landlord, caught between discomfort and fear of displeasing the powerful, drifted a step inside, as if to signal that the room was no longer entirely theirs. Evelyn felt the edges of panic pressing in. She could imagine the house stripped bare, her mother staring at blank walls, James trying to pretend that sleeping on the floor was an adventure. She had gone to the one man who could stop this, and still they came. The taller man reached toward the clock on the mantel, fingers closing around its wooden sides. He did not yank it or handle it roughly, but his indifference felt sharper than any blow. Before he could lift it, another voice cut through the cramped space, low and unmistakably certain. "Set that down." All three men turned. Evelyn's heart lurched. The doorway was filled by a dark coat dusted with snow, by broad shoulders, and a familiar raven ring glinting against black leather gloves. Adrian Blackthorne stood on the threshold of her world, as if it were the most natural thing for him to do, though the ceiling was too low for his height, and the room too small for his presence. The landlord stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The man with the folder straightened, color draining slightly from his face. "Your Grace," he said quickly, "we were informed that this account was under review, but in the meantime we thought it prudent to secure—" "You thought," Adrian interrupted, "that my instruction could be treated as decoration." His gaze rested on the man's hand near the clock, then shifted to the locket at Evelyn's throat, then back. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Leave everything," he said. "This household is under my protection." The words landed in the room like a door closing against a storm. The two men exchanged a glance, then began gathering their papers with hurried care. The landlord muttered an apology to Evelyn that did not quite reach his eyes and followed them out into the snow. Silence flooded the space once they were gone, broken only by the faint tick of the rescued clock. James looked from the door to Evelyn, then to the Duke, as if he could not quite believe any of it was real. Their mother tried to sit up, a hand pressed to her heart. "Your Grace," Evelyn managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not ask you to come here." Adrian stepped fully into the room at last, closing the door behind him. The contrast between his tailored coat and the worn edges of the furniture was stark, but there was no mockery in his eyes as he took in the narrow bed, the patched curtains, the small evidence of a life stretched thin. "No," he agreed, "but my name was at your door long before I was. I have seen the preliminary report on your husband's work. There are patterns in these debts that do not belong to me." He paused, then added, "I am not in the habit of allowing others to build private empires from my shadow." Evelyn folded her hands to keep them from shaking. "Then you believe me," she said. "You believe that someone has used your seal to ruin people like us." "I believe," he replied, "that one of the men closest to me may be selling pieces of my house a little at a time, and that he will not be careless enough to confess in front of auditors who owe their positions to him." His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw not only power there, but calculation tinged with something like weariness. "People reveal themselves when they feel untouchable," he said. "At dinners, at private gatherings, in the presence of those they consider beneath them." Understanding moved slowly through her, reluctant and frightening. "You need someone they will overlook," she said. "Someone who can stand in a room and hear what is not meant for her." "I need," Adrian answered, "a woman who can walk beside me into those rooms without raising suspicion. A seamstress will be ignored. A widow will be pitied. But a woman everyone believes I have chosen for myself they will try to impress, or to undermine. Either way, they will talk." The air seemed to thin around Evelyn as the shape of his meaning became clear. "What are you asking me to do, Your Grace?" He studied her for a moment, as if weighing not just her words, but the set of her shoulders and the stubborn line of her jaw. "I am asking," he said, "that you agree to become, for a time, my fiancée in name. In return, your debts will be cleared, your family secured, and the man who used Thomas Hart's death as a stepping stone will be brought into the light." The word Fiancée hung between them like a bridge built out over open air, both terrifying and impossible to ignore. Evelyn stared at him, the word he had offered circling in her mind with the slow, terrible grace of a snowflake that refused to land. Fiancé. It did not belong in this narrow room that still smelled faintly of boiled potatoes and coal dust. It did not belong beside the thin blanket that covered her mother or the scuffed boots by the door that James had long since outgrown, but still wore without complaint. "You cannot mean that," she said at last, her voice quiet but steady. "People in your world do not simply pick widows out of cramped houses and call them future brides." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite denial. "People in my world believe what is convenient for them," Adrian replied. "If I present you as a woman I have chosen, they will search for reasons to make sense of it. They will talk to you. They will talk around you. And if Victor Langley has been building his fortune on the broken backs of those he thinks no one will miss, he will slip. Men like him always do when they feel safe." Evelyn glanced at her mother, who watched them with anxious eyes, and at James, whose jaw was set in a way that reminded her painfully of Thomas. The thought of tying herself, even in pretense, to the man whose seal had been stamped on their ruin crawled over her skin. Yet the alternative was to stand still and watch that ruin finish what it had begun. "And when you are finished with this plan," she asked, tasting the cost of each word, "when you have what you need from these people, what happens to us?" "Your debts will be erased," he said. "Your home secured in writing, not in vague promises. Your brother will be given a position or an apprenticeship that does not depend on the whims of creditors. Your mother will have a physician who comes when she calls, and not only when a bill is waved under his nose. After that, any bond between you and me will end if you wish it to. If you wish it to." As if she would have any wish left that did not first pass through the hands of men like him. Still, when she looked at her family, she saw no other path that did not end in slow undoing. She lifted her chin. "Very well, Your Grace," she said. "I will stand beside you as long as it is necessary. But I will not pretend for myself. I will pretend for them." For a heartbeat something gentler flickered in his eyes, quickly buried. "That is all I require," he answered. Within days, the world shifted on its axis. Evelyn found herself standing in a dressing room that smelled of lavender and starch, the walls lined with mirrors framed in gilt. Seamstresses moved around her like a small storm of pins and fabric, fitting a gown of deep blue silk to her shape. The dress was simple by the standards of the elite, but the fabric slid through her fingers like water, and the bodice had been cut to flatter without shouting. She watched herself in the mirror, almost waiting for her reflection to shake its head and step out of the glass, leaving her standing there in her old black dress. Instead, a stranger stared back, pale and composed, a faint line of tension at the corners of her mouth. A small knock sounded, and the seamstresses parted. Adrian stepped into the doorway, his gaze moving over the scene with a quick, assessing sweep. He did not stare as the women in the workroom did when they fitted wealthy clients. His expression did not change, yet she felt his attention as surely as if he had reached out and steadied her shoulders. "It will do," he said to the head seamstress, then looked to Evelyn. "They are waiting in the blue salon. You will meet Victor Langley tonight." The name moved through her like a draft under a door. "What do you intend for me to say to him?" she asked. "Very little," Adrian replied. "Polite questions. A remark about how complicated financial matters seem to those who do not read ledgers for a living. Men like Victor enjoy explaining themselves. They reveal more in what they choose to simplify than in what they guard." That evening, under chandeliers that cast soft light over polished floors, Evelyn walked at Adrian's side into a smaller, more intimate gathering than the winter ball had been. A few lords and ladies stood in small clusters, laughter rippling like a practiced melody. Conversations faltered as they entered, eyes sharpening, curiosities waking. She heard it in the lowered voices, in the way fans stilled for a moment. The Duke of Ravenska had brought a woman no one recognized, and named her as his chosen partner. Victor Langley approached them with a practiced smile and a bow that dipped just low enough to be respectful without touching humility. He was of average height, with careful hair and a face that might have been kindly if not for a certain tightness around the eyes. "Your Grace," he said, "and this must be the lady I heard mentioned in passing. Miss Hart, is it?" "Mrs. Hart," Adrian corrected evenly. "My fiancée." The words settled over the circle of listeners like a dropped glass that somehow did not shatter. Evelyn felt the weight of it on her skin, but she forced herself to meet Victor's gaze and offer her hand. His fingers were cool and dry, his grip light. "It is an honor, Mrs. Hart," he said. "I had no idea His Grace could be persuaded to share his time with anyone for longer than a business meeting." The words were joking, but there was a searching edge behind them, a quickness in his eyes as they flicked between her and Adrian, measuring, calculating. Evelyn smiled with the softness she had learned to use on difficult customers in the dressmaker's shop. "I know very little of business, Mr. Langley," she said. "Numbers slip away from me. Perhaps you will be kind enough to explain some of them one day. I would hate to misunderstand what stands between those who have and those who owe." For just a moment, his smile froze, a hairline crack in the polite mask. Then it smoothed again. "I would be delighted," he replied. But as the evening went on, as wine was poured and stories were traded, Evelyn noticed how often his gaze returned to her, not with admiration, but with suspicion, as if somewhere in the worn corners of her soul he had glimpsed a ledger he could not yet read. The weeks that followed moved with a deceptive smoothness, like ice over deep water. Invitations multiplied, each card heavy with expectation and curiosity. The story of the Duke of Ravinska's unexpected engagement had spread through drawing rooms and club parlors until even people who had never seen Evelyn spoke of her with knowing smiles. Some praised Adrian's unpredictability, calling it proof that he could not be read or managed. Others whispered of a tragic love story, inventing details to fill the silence Evelyn kept about her life before him. Through it all, she walked at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her face composed while her thoughts darted between her mother's quiet improvement and James's cautious hope, and the knowledge that every step she took in satin shoes was part of a path leading toward a reckoning she could not yet see. Adrian grew more deliberate in his dealings, inviting Victor to meetings, deferring to him in small matters, allowing the other man to feel his influence deepen. Evelyn watched it happen with a mixture of unease and reluctant admiration. She saw how Adrian asked questions that seemed harmless but pressed gently at the edges of Victor's careful stories. She noticed how other men in Victor's circle relaxed when they believed their positions were safe. Yet the closer the net drew, the more she felt something else tightening around her own life. One afternoon, as she waited in a small sitting room at Adrian's townhouse, she overheard two maids whispering while they polished silver. "They say the engagement will not last," one murmured. "That it is only a phase, a way for His Grace to distract himself before he chooses someone suitable." The other laughed softly. "Perhaps she thinks she can keep him. Poor thing. It never ends well when someone reaches too high." Evelyn turned away from their words, eyes fixed on the snow outside the window. She had promised herself she would not care what strangers thought, but every casual prediction of her eventual fall made the floor under her feel less certain. The announcement of the winter masquerade came as no surprise. It was the kind of event people like Victor enjoyed, a chance to dress their secrets in silk and pretend anonymity made them braver. Adrian told her about it in his study, the light from the window outlining his profile. "They will all be there," he said. "Members of Parliament, bankers, men who have grown comfortable with blurred lines. Victor will feel protected in that crowd." "And you intend to challenge him there?" she asked. "Not directly," Adrian answered. "But there are documents he does not yet know I possess. Transfers he signed, accounts he shifted. If the right eyes see them, he will no longer be able to hide." He hesitated then, as if weighing something heavier than ledgers. "However, there is a risk. When men like him sense danger, they look for someone to blame. You will be an easy target. You are visible now in ways you were not before." She heard the unspoken question. "Are you willing to stand in that light and let it cut?" "He has already used my husband's death as a stepping stone," Evelyn replied quietly. "He has already tried to strip my home bare. I am tired of being the silent cost in other people's calculations." The night of the masquerade arrived clear and bitterly cold. The sky above London was so sharp it seemed close enough to touch. Montclair House glowed again, lanterns lining the steps, music spilling out into the frosted air. Inside, faces disappeared behind masks of gold and black, voices rising and falling in a strangely intimate anonymity. Evelyn's mask was simple, edged in silver, the ribbon tied at the back of her neck by a maid whose hands shook with excitement at being included in something so grand. As she descended the stairs at Adrian's side, no one knew precisely who she was, yet everyone knew. The Duke of Ravenska had never been more watched. Near the base of the staircase, Victor waited, his own mask leaving his mouth visible, the curve of his smile giving nothing away. He bowed with easy confidence. "Your Grace, Mrs. Hart," he said. "What a fitting night to celebrate a partnership built on daring." His gaze lingered on Evelyn's mask. "I admit, when I first heard of your engagement, I thought it merely dramatic. But now I see the appeal. Reinvention is a powerful thing." She returned his look steadily, though her pulse quickened. "Some of us do not reinvent," she said. "Some of us simply survive what is done in other people's names." For an instant, something colder than amusement flickered in his eyes. Before he could respond, another guest approached Adrian with urgent news of a visiting dignitary. The Duke excused himself, promising to return, and was drawn into a knot of men in dark coats and bright masks. Evelyn remained where she was, a small island in a sea of velvet and laughter. As the evening wore on, she began to sense a shift in the room. Conversations broke off when she approached. A lady she had spoken with kindly only days before turned away to adjust her glove as if she had not seen her. A gentleman glanced at her, then at Victor, and smiled in a way that did not feel friendly. The realization came slowly, like cold seeping through fabric. Someone had been talking. Someone had twisted the story of who she was and why she stood there. When she finally caught Adrian's eye across the room, there was a new heaviness in his expression, as if he, too, had heard. He crossed to her with controlled steps, his mask pushed up, his jaw set. "Evelyn," he said, and there was a formality in the way he spoke her name that made her stomach knot. "May I have a word?" The music swelled behind them as he led her a few paces away, not far enough to be unseen, just far enough for their words to reach each other and the ears of those nearest. It was then, with the weight of a room listening, that she understood the next move in his plan would not just expose Victor. It would cost her something she had not realized she had begun to want. Music spilled around them in bright, tumbling waves, but the space between Adrian and Evelyn felt suddenly thin and cold. His mask was pushed back, his gray eyes bare and unguarded in a way that made her want to trust him and fear him at once. Around them, fans stilled and conversations softened, drawn toward the gravity of whatever was about to happen. "There are rumors," he said quietly, but not so quietly that nearby guests could not hear. "They say you sought me out not because of accident or fate, but because you calculated my usefulness. That you have been speaking with certain men about my ledgers and my weaknesses." Evelyn felt every pair of unseen eyes press against her mask. Her first instinct was to deny, to reach for the truth she and Adrian had built between them in that lamplit study. But his words were too carefully chosen, his tone too controlled. This was a performance, and she had agreed to step onto this stage with him. "If I have spoken of you," she replied, her voice clear despite the tightness in her chest, "it has never been of your weaknesses, your grace. Only of the weight your name can carry when it is placed on the wrong papers." A soft ripple of reaction moved through the nearest circle of guests. Somewhere to the left, she heard Victor's low chuckle. Adrian's gaze flicked past her for the briefest moment, then returned. "Nevertheless," he said, and the word cut more deeply than she expected, "I cannot ignore what has been brought to me. For the sake of the house I am sworn to protect, I must make a choice." He drew a breath, each syllable that followed shaped with ice. "Our engagement must end." The words did not explode so much as sink, heavy and shocking, into the heart of the room. Evelyn felt as if the floor had dropped half an inch. It was not a large movement, not enough to send her to her knees, but enough to make her balance uncertain. Masks turned toward them, some with barely concealed satisfaction, others with startled pity. Someone whispered that they had known it, that it could never last. Victor stepped nearer, his expression arranged into something like concern. "Surely, your grace," he said smoothly. "There is no need to make such an announcement in the middle of a celebration. The lady must be overwhelmed." His eyes slid to Evelyn, and in them she saw relief and triumph braided together. If the engagement ended, then she would return to the shadows, and any word she spoke against him would sound like bitterness, not truth. Adrian turned slightly, including Victor and several other men in his next words. On the contrary, Mr. Langley, he said, there are some matters that require witnesses. I would rather no one here be forced to say later that they did not know. From inside his coat he drew a slim packet of papers, folded and sealed not with wax, but with small ribbons and the discreet marks of several different banks. A murmur rose. Even behind masks, people knew the look of documents that mattered. For some weeks now, Adrian continued, I have been advised by you and others that certain accounts and debts are necessary burdens, that they are unfortunate but unavoidable. However, further examination has shown an interesting pattern. He handed the papers to a man standing nearby, a senior banker whose reputation for caution was nearly as solid as Adrian's reputation for severity. These transfers, the Duke said, bear my signature, but not my authorization. Funds moved from trust accounts into private holdings. Debts packaged and sold under my name. The proceeds deposited elsewhere. And here, he added, with a glance at Victor, are the accounts where that money rests. The banker's eyes moved over the pages, his brows drawing together. Another gentleman, a member of Parliament with influence over trade laws, leaned in to see. The tension in the air shifted. Victor's smile thinned. Your Grace, he said, too quickly. With respect, you misunderstand what you are looking at. Complex arrangements can appear suspicious to the untrained eye. Fortunately, Adrian replied, the men holding those pages are very well trained, and they have already given preliminary opinions that align closely with the concerns first brought to me by Mrs. Hart. Every head turned to her again. Evelyn felt the weight of those gazes, but she lifted her chin. Her voice did not tremble when she spoke. My husband tried to warn someone, she said. He saw figures that did not belong where they had been placed. He died before he could make himself heard. I will not make the same mistake. The banker cleared his throat, his face pale but composed. If these transfers are as they appear, he said carefully, then there are serious questions to be answered. Not by His Grace, but by whoever executed them in his name. The member of Parliament nodded once, his eyes hard above his mask. And those questions will not be confined to this room. Victor stepped forward half a pace, his mask tilting slightly. You will take the word of a widow over a man who has served you for years, he demanded, the smoothness cracking for the first time. Adrian did not move away from Evelyn. If anything, his stance shifted just enough to place himself subtly between her and Victor's rising frustration. I will take the word of the numbers, he said. They do not grieve. They do not lie from fear. They simply add up. He lifted his gaze to the circle of powerful faces around them. These documents have already been copied and provided to those with the authority to investigate. Tonight is not a trial. It is a courtesy, an opportunity for some of you to consider how closely you wish your names to be tied to Mr. Langley's arrangements. Silence followed, heavy and bright. Then, slowly, people began to step back from Victor, the space around him widening as if the floor itself had become uncertain beneath his feet. He stood very still, his hands at his sides, his carefully crafted ease gone. Evelyn watched the realization settle over him that the shadow he had used for so long no longer sheltered him, but exposed him. And somewhere beneath her own shock and hurt, a small, fierce part of her discovered that even in the moment Adrian had publicly severed their bond, he had also ensured that her voice would be the one thing Victor could not easily silence again. The days after the masquerade unfolded like the slow turning of a heavy wheel. Word of what had happened at Montclair House traveled faster than any carriage. By the end of the week, Victor Langley's name, once spoken with confidence in hushed financial circles, had become something people avoided mentioning too loudly. Committees were formed. Quiet inquiries became formal investigations. Ledgers that had slept on high shelves for years were brought down and opened under new eyes. Evelyn watched it all from a distance she had not chosen. The engagement that had placed her at the center of everything had indeed ended that night. Adrian's declaration was repeated in drawing rooms with satisfaction by those who had always doubted her place at his side. But so was the fact that he had stood in front of a room full of power and tied his reputation to her testimony. That contradiction made it difficult for anyone to dismiss her as merely a scorned woman. Letters began to arrive at her small house, not from gossiping ladies, but from men and women whose names she did not know, thanking her in careful, awkward handwriting. They wrote of debts that had been reassessed, of notices withdrawn after the investigations began, of the first deep breath they had taken in months. Some enclosed small coins, begging her to accept them as tokens of gratitude. She returned the coins when she could, with notes that said she had never done any of this alone. Her mother's color slowly improved with regular visits from the doctor, whose bills no longer threatened to crush them. James came home one afternoon with ink on his cuffs and a cautious pride in his voice as he explained that he had been taken on as a clerk in an office that handled honest accounts, recommended, the supervisor said, by a reference he would only describe as very high. Evelyn did not ask for names. Some gifts were easier to accept when they arrived without signatures. Winter began to loosen its grip on the city, only slightly, but enough that the streets were more often wet than frozen. It was on one such gray, dripping afternoon that a familiar carriage stopped outside the Hart home. For a moment, Evelyn simply watched from the window, her hand resting on the thin curtain. She could have pretended not to be there, but she had never been a woman who hid from what hurt. When she opened the door, Adrian stood on the step, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. He held his hat in one hand, the raven ring on the other glinting dully in the weak light. He looked very much as he always had, yet slimmer somehow, as if the weeks had carved away something invisible that he no longer needed. Mrs. Hart, he said, the formality of the title at odds with the quiet that settled between them. Your Grace, she answered. For a heartbeat neither of them moved. Then he glanced past her into the modest hallway and smiled, just a little. May I come in? Or would you prefer that the neighbors have the satisfaction of watching the Duke of Ravenska be refused on the doorstep? There was a thread of wryness in his voice that she had not heard before. Evelyn stepped back. You may come in, she said. The house seemed smaller with him inside it, but not in a way that made her ashamed. If anything, she saw more clearly how far they had come. The clock on the mantel still ticked, their chairs were still theirs, but there was a sense now that the walls no longer listened for the next knock of a collector. Adrian took it all in with the same steady gaze he had brought to his own ledgers. The inquiries are progressing, he said at last. Victor has been removed from his position. Others who profited from his schemes are being required to make restitution. It will not fix everything. Some losses cannot be repaid in coin, but the shadow he built is smaller now. And your name? She asked. Has it escaped that shadow? He gave a small, honest shrug. I imagine some will always associate me with what happened, he said. But that is not entirely unjust. I left doors unattended. Men like Victor walked through them. I intend to do better. Silence settled for a moment, filled with the soft sounds of the house. Evelyn watched him, weighing memories of the man who had once felt like a threat, then a necessity, then something too complicated to name. You ended our engagement in front of everyone, she said quietly. You made me the story they knew they were right about. He met her gaze without flinching. If I had ended it in private, Victor would have used you as a shield, he said. He would have pointed to your presence at my side, and said every question we raised came from a woman who stood to gain by destroying him. By breaking the engagement publicly, I meant to remove you from his reach. He paused. I did not intend to break more than that. But intentions do not spare feelings. The admission was simple, but it stripped away more of the distance between them than any grand apology could have. Evelyn drew a slow breath. My debts are gone, she said. My family is safe. My husband's name is no longer just an entry in a ledger no one will acknowledge. For that, I am grateful. She hesitated, then added, but I will not step back into a role that exists only because it is useful to you. Good, Adrian replied softly. The word surprised her. He moved a step closer, careful not to crowd the small space. Because if I ask you for anything now, it will not be as a man drowning in his own house, reaching for the nearest hand. It will be as someone who has learned what it means when a woman like you chooses to stand beside him. The room felt very still. Outside, rain tapped gently against the glass. And what are you asking? Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. He drew in a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. I am asking, he said, whether you would walk with me, without disguises or bargains. Whether you would consider, in time, becoming not the fiancé I invented, but the partner I did not know I needed. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of all that had come before. The attic cold, the ballrooms bright, the letters, the ledgers, the choices made when every path felt like a trap. When she opened them, she saw not the feared Duke of Ravinska, but a man who had been forced to see himself clearly, and had not looked away. "I will walk with you," she said at last, "as long as we remember that we met first as two people standing in the wreckage of what others had done, not in a fairy tale." A quiet warmth moved through his expression, subtle and profound. He did not reach for her hand immediately. Instead, he stood there in her narrow front room, allowing the moment to be small and real. When she finally stepped forward and placed her hand in his, it felt less like surrender and more like balance. Outside, the rain eased. The city went on with its noise and its bargains, its debts and its quiet griefs. But in that house, for the first time in a long time, the future was not something to fear, but something to be shaped by two people who had learned, in very different ways, how heavy a name and a heart could be. And somewhere beneath the sound of the ticking clock, there was the faintest sense that some lives only find their true measure when they refuse to be defined by what was taken from them, and instead choose what they will give to each other.